Tonight, under a cool sheet, you feel it before you think about it. A faint ripple across your forearm, tiny bumps rising on the skin as the room settles into silence. You have known that feeling since childhood. A draft near the window, a sudden memory, a song that lands a little too hard. And there it is again. Most people treat that moment as nothing, just goosebumps, just one of those small things the body does on its own. But vestigial traits, the evolutionary ghosts in the human body, begin exactly there, in the places that seem too ordinary to matter. Just quiet signs that your body is older than your name, older than your language, older than the world you think you live in every day. Those little bumps are pulled upward by tiny muscles called arrector pili muscles. In animals with thick fur, that reflex makes the coat stand up. Better warmth, bigger shape, a stronger warning. In you, on mostly bare skin, it does almost none of that old job anymore. And still, the reflex remains. It fires when you are cold, sometimes when you are startled, sometimes when you are deeply moved. As if a much older body is still speaking through this one, in a language made of skin. That is the first thing to understand tonight. A vestige is not a useless flaw. It is testimony, a small report from older bodies still visible in you now. In 1893, Robert Wiedersheim tried to list these traces in human anatomy, about 86 of them. Later, many of those structures turned out to keep minor functions after all, which makes this story even more interesting, not less. Because the body does not simply throw its past away. It keeps it, trims it, repurposes it, and lets it hide in plain sight. And goosebumps are only the beginning, because one of the strangest of these signs is waiting in the corner of your eye. If this kind of quiet science wonder is your thing, give the video a like and stay with me. That corner of the eye is easy to miss. You are in the bathroom for a second, maybe under the pale light above the mirror, maybe rinsing sleep from your face. And if you look closely, there is a small pink fold tucked near the inner edge. Most people have seen it without ever really seeing it. It does not announce itself. It just sits there, quiet, soft, almost shy. And yet that little fold has a strange story in your whole body. It is called the plica semilunaris. Not a dramatic name, not a famous one, but it is the remnant of something much older, the third eyelid. In birds and reptiles, that extra lid still works. It can sweep across the eye, helping protect it while keeping vision. In you, that old structure no longer closes over the eye in that full way. What remains is only a reduced form, small and still, a deep time leftover at the edge of your gaze. And this is where people often get the wrong idea. A vestige is not the same thing as a mistake. It is not proof that the body is careless. It is evidence that the body has a history. Robert Wiedersheim, back in 1893, tried to gather these traces into a list. But the real lesson was never just the counting. It was the pattern. Human anatomy is full of forms that have changed roles, shrunk, softened, stayed on. So now you have two clues already. The skin rises for fur you no longer wear. The eye keeps a trace of a lid it no longer uses. Because change in living things is rarely neat, the body does not clean house. It layers, it edits, it leaves edges behind. And once you begin to notice that, even the base of your spine starts to feel different. Because one of the clearest signs is not hidden in soft tissue at all, but in bone. And bone tells the story in a colder, quieter way. If you shift a little in bed or lean back in a hard chair, there is a point at the very base of your spine that takes the pressure first. You almost never think about it. It is just there, small, firm, easy to ignore. But that little end piece, the coccyx, is one of the clearest deep time leftovers you carry, an actual remnant fused into your skeleton, What you feel there is the far reduced trace of an ancestral tail. That can sound strange at first, almost too strange to belong to your own body, and yet it does. The same body that kept the old skin reflex, the same body that holds that quiet fold near the eye, also ends in a structure that points backward into a much older shape. Not because you are unfinished, and not because the body is careless, but because change in anatomy often comes by shortening, fusing, and reworking what was already there. The most astonishing part is that this is not only written into your adult skeleton. For a brief stretch in early development, human embryos grow a tail around weeks 4 to 6, and then it regresses. Just for a little while, before memory, before language, before the face in the mirror becomes yours, the body passes through a form that reveals more than it keeps. You never saw it, you never felt it, but it happened all the same. That is what makes these traces so powerful. They do not only sit in the finished body, they appear in the process of becoming one. A vestige is not always a faded object left behind at the end. Sometimes it flashes into view at the beginning, then slips away again as the rest of you forms around it. And once you let that sink in, another human moment starts to look different too. A newborn hand closing around a finger with startling force, as if it remembers holding on to something no baby now will ever touch. That newborn grip is one of the most moving examples, because you do not meet it in a museum or a lab. You meet it in warm skin, in milk-sweet breath, in a tiny hand closing around one finger with surprising force. For a second, it can feel almost deliberate, as if the baby is choosing not to let go. What you are seeing there is the palmar reflex. In a newborn, that grasp can be fierce. And in the story written through the human body, it points backward again. Not to a recent memory, not to anything the child has learned, but to a much older pattern. Infant primates needed to cling to a mother's fur. That reflex mattered. It helped them stay close, stay carried, stay safe. In a modern human baby, the setting has changed, but the motion remains. This is where the subject becomes more intimate than most people expect. Goosebumps can feel like a curious little leftover. The fold at the eye can seem hidden and remote. The coccyx sits out of sight unless you go looking for it. But this happens in your hands. You can feel it. A deep time leftover becomes personal when it curls its fingers around yours in the first days of life. And again, the old mistake would be to say, so it serves no purpose. That is too simple. Robert Wiedersheim's old list from 1893 matters here only because later biology had to become more careful. A structure or reflex can echo an older world and still take part in the present one. That is the rule tonight. Not uselessness, but inheritance with change. So now the pattern is harder to ignore. The skin remembers fur. The eye keeps a reduced trace of the third eyelid. The spine ends with the remnant of a tail. The newborn hand closes with a primate past still flickering through it. And once enough of those clues gather in one place, a larger question begins to rise. Why the body keeps so many old chapters at all? That question matters more than it seems, because once you notice these traces, it is tempting to imagine the body as a cluttered attic, old things left behind, never cleared out. But that picture is wrong. A human body is not assembled from scratch the way a machine is laid out on a clean table. It is built through inheritance. It works by modifying what came before, folding older structures into newer ones, reducing some, reshaping others, keeping more than you might expect. That is why the same body can carry a skin reflex from a furrier past, a faint remnant of the third eyelid, a tail end fused into the spine, and a newborn grasp that still closes with that old primate urgency. The pattern is continuity. And this is where Robert Wiedersheim becomes useful in a different way. Not because his 1893 list settled the matter, but because it showed how strong the temptation is to look at an inherited structure and say, well, that must be pointless. Later, many of the things he gathered turned out to keep minor functions. That correction is important. A vestige can be reduced without being meaningless. It can be changed without being dead. The body does not erase history with a hard line. It edits in layers. If you think about your own life, you already know that kind of layering. A house keeps an old doorway sealed behind fresh paint. A hand remembers how to write a name years after it has stopped writing it every day. In the same quiet way, anatomy keeps older solutions inside newer forms because living things move forward by revision. So these remnants are no real surprise. The real surprise is how ordinary they are. They sit in places you touch every day and almost never read correctly. Your skin, your eye, your spine, the grip of a baby, all of them saying the same thing in different ways. And once you stop asking, why is this still here? Another question begins to press closer. What else in your body feels modern, but is actually very, very old? That is the deeper shift, really. Once you start looking this way, the body stops feeling like a finished object and starts feeling like a revised manuscript. You are not seeing random scraps. You are seeing old solutions, carried forward because life changes by altering what is already there. A reflex gets reduced. A structure gets folded into a smaller roll. A bone loses one shape and keeps another. The result is not clutter. It is continuity under pressure. So the old question, why didn't this disappear, can miss the point. Disappearing is only one option. Shrinking, changing, and staying partly in use are options too. Think about the examples already in your hands. The tiny arrector pili muscle still tugs at the skin, even though your body hair no longer rises into a useful coat. That pink fold by the eye remains after the old screen of the third eyelid has faded into quiet anatomy. The coccyx no longer extends into a tail, yet it still marks where one once was. The newborn grip does not belong to a furry mother anymore, but the motion survives the lost setting. Each one says the same thing in a different accent. The body is historical. And that history does something subtle to the way you think about yourself. Because most of the time, you live as if your body begins with you. Your habits, your mirror, your aches, your favorite way to sleep. But these traces refuse that illusion. They remind you that long before your first memory, your form was already carrying decisions made by older bodies in older worlds. Robert Wiedersheim understood enough in 1893 to see that these remnants mattered. What later science corrected was the easy assumption that old means useless. It does not. Old can mean reduced. It can mean redirected. It can mean almost silent, but still present. Once you accept that, a strange thought begins to settle in. Some of the most familiar sensations in your day may not be modern at all. They may be ancient, hiding inside the ordinary. That is when the ordinary day starts to feel a little less ordinary. You pull a shirt over your shoulders and the fabric brushes the skin. You blink at a bright screen. You shift in your seat without thinking. None of it feels ancient. None of it announces itself. And yet, the body moving through those small moments is carrying signs from far older conditions than the room around you. More quietly than that. More persistently. This is why these traces are so easy to miss. They do not arrive as a spectacle. They arrive as normal life. A chill on the arm, and that old reflex stirs. A glance in the mirror, and the small fold at the eye is there, if you bother to notice it. The lower spine takes your weight, and the tail remnant says nothing at all. A newborn closes its hand, and an ancient pattern shows itself in the gentlest possible way. The same body that feels entirely present tense is also full of inherited edits. And maybe that is the real source of the unease here. Not that the evidence is strange, but that it is intimate. If these signs lived only in textbooks, you could leave them there. But they do not. They are in your skin, your posture, your earliest reflexes. They belong to your life so completely that you had to be taught to see them. That is also why the old misunderstanding keeps returning. People hear the word vestige and imagine some dead thing, some abandoned scrap. But a body is not a landfill of failed ideas. It is a living record of what was changed, reduced, kept, and carried forward. Robert Wiedersheim's old list matters less as a final answer than as a warning about how quickly we simplify what we do not yet understand. And once you stop looking for dramatic proof, a different thought begins to take shape. Maybe the deepest history in you is not hidden in rare exceptions at all, but in the most familiar sensations you have never learned how to read. That is where the whole subject begins to change shape. At first, it sounds like a collection of odd details: a bump on the skin, a fold in the eye, a small bone at the end of the spine, a newborn's grip. But after a while, those details stop feeling separate. They begin to line up. And when they do, you start to see something larger than anatomy. You start to see a rule. The rule is simple, but it asks a lot of your imagination. The body does not rebuild itself from nothing each time a form changes across deep time. It works with what is already there. It shortens, it softens, it redirects. It keeps an old motion, but gives it a quieter role. It leaves a mark where a larger structure used to be. So a vestige can feel so strange to learn about. It forces you to think historically about something you usually experience only in the present. You can feel that tension in your own ordinary life. Your body feels immediate. Your hands, your eyes, the way you curl under a blanket, the way you turn toward a sound in the dark. But inside that very present body are traces that belong to older conditions. Ancient not only in a poetic sense, ancient in structure, ancient in reflex, ancient in the path the body still follows as it forms. That is why the old misunderstanding matters. If you call these things pointless, you stop looking too soon. If you call them mistakes, you miss the deeper truth. They are evidence that change leaves seams. The body carries forward more than it discards. Robert Wiedersheim saw enough in 1893 to name a long list of remnants, but later science had to become gentler and more exact about what remnant really means: reduced, altered, carried. And once you see the body that way, even your own sense of I starts to loosen a little, because some part of what feels most personal may actually be inherited pattern, still moving underneath your everyday life. That is the unsettling part. The closer you bring this subject to the self, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line between what is you and what is inherited pattern. When you feel a chill and the skin responds, it does not ask your permission. When a baby grips, it does not decide. When the body forms in its earliest weeks, it does not pause to explain why an older shape appears for a little while and then withdraws. These things happen beneath opinion, beneath intention. They belong to the architecture of being human, and so they can feel so intimate once you really let them in. Most of the time, you think of identity from the top down: your thoughts, your voice, your memories, the expression in the mirror that you call your own. But this story keeps tugging from below, from the skin, from the corner of the eye, from the base of the spine, from the hand of a newborn that closes with a strength that arrived long before any personal history could. And slowly, almost against your will, a different picture begins to form. You are not only a mind living in a body, you are also a body carrying older instructions, older compromises, older forms that were never fully erased. That does not make you less yourself. It makes the self deeper than it first appears. So the old language around these traces can be so misleading. If you hear only leftover, you imagine debris, but that is too blunt. A vestige is not just what remains after something important is gone. Sometimes it is what remains because life changed direction without wiping the slate clean. The old thing grows quieter, smaller, less obvious, but not absent. And when you feel that, the body stops looking like a polished final draft. It starts to look like revision layered on revision, each older sentence still faintly visible beneath the new one. Which raises a question that is less comfortable than it sounds at first. If so much of the body is inherited in this way, then how many of your little physical quirks are not random quirks at all, but echoes you have mistaken for personality? That question has a quiet way of staying with you. Maybe not in some dramatic, life-changing flash, just a thought that follows you into ordinary moments. While you rub sleep from your eyes, while you pull your knees closer under a blanket, while you feel your skin answer a cool draft before your mind has even named the temperature. Once you have seen these signs for what they are, the body becomes harder to take for granted. And that is where the idea of variation begins to matter. Not every old trace shows itself in exactly the same way, and not every person notices the same clues with equal ease. The body carries history, yes, but it carries it through living difference. Some signs feel vivid. Others are so reduced they almost disappear into the background. It can be obvious in one moment and nearly invisible in the next, depending on what the body is doing and how closely you are willing to look. That matters because it keeps this story from turning into a neat little shelf of curiosities. It is not just goosebumps over here, the eye fold over there, the coccyx at the bottom of the spine, and the newborn grasp in some separate category of infant behavior. They are all part of one deeper truth. Inherited forms do not vanish cleanly. They fade unevenly. They shift roles. They remain in bodies that are still fully alive, fully present, fully human. So the old language has to be handled carefully. If you hear remnant, you might picture something abandoned. But the better picture is softer than that. Think of an old doorway sealed behind a painted wall. The room has changed. The house is still in use. But part of the old shape remains, quietly guiding what came after. Accept that, and another thought begins to open. If the body keeps old structures by reducing them, then some of its deepest history may be hiding not in what stands out, but in what has become almost too subtle to see at all. That almost invisible quality is important because it changes how you imagine an old trace in the first place. Not every one of these signs behaves the same way. Some act for a moment and vanish. Goosebumps rise, then smooth away. Some sit quietly in place for a lifetime, like that small fold in the eye. Some are built into the frame of the body, as steady and unannounced as the coccyx. and some appear at the very beginning of life with startling clarity. A newborn hand gripping, an early tail forming and then receding, before you were ever conscious enough to know it happened. So this is a whole range, not one kind of evidence repeated 4 times. Motion, structure, reflex, development. That is why the subject feels richer the longer you stay with it. The body is not preserving its past in one neat drawer. It is doing it in different layers, in different tissues, on different timelines. A vestige can be a flash, a fold, a fused ending, a brief stage on the road to becoming you. And that matters, because it keeps you from making the easy mistake. If you expect an old trait to look dramatic, you will miss the ones that whisper. If you expect it to be totally functionless, you will misread the ones that stayed and took on quieter work. Robert Wiedersheim, in 1893, named many of these structures because he saw the pattern. Later science had to refine the language, not erase the pattern itself. The correction was subtle but powerful. Old does not mean worthless. Reduced does not mean irrelevant. Once you understand that, the body begins to feel less like an object, with a few odd exceptions, and more like a living gradient of histories. Some bright, some faint, some still active in ways you barely notice. And there is a consequence to seeing it that way. Because if ancient history can survive in skin, eye, spine, and infant reflex, then the next question is no longer what these traces are. It is how far back the body is still willing to remember. That is the point where the body stops looking like a set of facts and starts feeling like a landscape. You have already seen the main landmarks. The skin that still lifts for a coat you no longer wear. The small eye fold that hints at the third eyelid. The coccyx, quiet at the end of the spine. The newborn grasp, fierce and tender at once. Robert Wiedersheim standing back in 1893 and trying to name a whole field of traces at once, even if later biology had to soften and correct some of his conclusions. None of those details lives alone anymore. They begin to speak to one another. And once they do, the question changes. At first you ask, what is this? Then, why is it still here? But now another question moves into place. Not about any one trait, but about the rule underneath all of them. Why does change in the body look like revision instead of replacement? Why does old form linger inside new form so often, even when the old use has faded? The answer is not dramatic. It is almost humble. Living bodies do not begin from a clean table. They inherit. They alter. They carry forward. A reflex can lose most of its original purpose and still remain in reduced form. A structure can shrink and shift instead of vanishing. An early developmental stage can appear briefly, then fold away. The old story does not disappear all at once. It gets overwritten, line by line. So these signs can feel so strangely emotional when you learn to see them. They make you aware that your body is layered, built from older answers to older worlds, still visible in softened outlines. Not because you are poorly made, and not because life failed to tidy up after itself, but because continuity is how living form moves through time. And if continuity is the rule, then the next step is harder to avoid, because it means some of the most human parts of you may not be new at all, only ancient things wearing a modern face. That modern face is part of what makes the story so easy to miss. You look at yourself and see a finished human form. 2 eyes, 2 hands, a spine built for the life you know, warm skin, quick reflexes, ordinary posture. Nothing about it seems transitional. Nothing says, I am in the middle of a very long rewrite. And yet, that is closer to the truth than most of us ever imagine. The body you live in is stable enough to feel complete, but historical enough to keep showing its edits. This matters because change does not erase evenly. Some things shrink until they are nearly invisible. Some stay obvious but change their role. Some appear only for a moment, like that early tail in development, then fold back into the larger plan. Some remain as reflexes that no longer serve the old world in the old way. That unevenness is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. A vestige does not vanish on a schedule that feels neat to the human mind. Think of the examples you already carry. The skin still responds before thought. The eye still keeps its quiet fold. The spine still ends with a trace of an older shape. The newborn hand still closes with that fierce, inherited motion. None of these signs means you are half finished. They mean the body changes by modification, not replacement. It keeps working parts of older sentences even while the paragraph around them becomes something new. And that is where the subject becomes more alive than a list of strange facts. Because if change is uneven, then these signs are not just evidence of what once was. They are evidence of process, of form being revised across deep time without ever starting over from nothing. Once you feel that, another possibility begins to open. Maybe the most surprising thing is not that the body remembers old structures. Maybe it is that the remembering has never fully stopped. And some of what seems fixed in you may still belong to a story that is not entirely finished. That unfinished feeling can be hard to sit with at first, because you are used to thinking of the body as settled. You wake up in the same shape each morning, the same hands, the same face, the same spine meeting the mattress, the same skin answering cold air, the same eyes adjusting to light. Daily life gives you a strong illusion of permanence. But these old traces keep interrupting that illusion in small, respectful ways. They say it is inherited, and inheritance is never perfectly smooth. It carries variation with it. Even the signs you have already met do not always announce themselves with the same force in every person or in every moment. A reflex can flare and fade. A fold can be present and barely noticed. A remnant can sit inside the skeleton so quietly that you never think of it unless someone teaches you to look. That matters because it means they are not museum labels pasted onto identical bodies. They live inside real human difference. This is where the subject becomes even more intimate. You begin to wonder about family resemblance in a new way. Not only the obvious things, your mother's eyes, your father's hands, the way a grandparent sat in a chair, but the subtler habits of form, the little responses no one ever talks about. The body as a line of continuity, not just in memory or appearance, but in inherited pattern. And the old caution returns here too. Robert Wiedersheim gave one early language to these remnants in 1893, but biology kept adjusting the picture because living bodies refused to fit perfectly into neat categories. Old structures can stay, old reflexes can soften, old forms can shift into quieter roles without losing their connection to what came before. So the deeper you go, the less this feels like a cabinet of oddities. It starts to feel like a family archive written in flesh, with some pages clear, some faded, and some still being deciphered. Which leads to a stranger thought still. If variation is part of the story, then maybe these old traces are not only about the past. Maybe they are also about the present body, still carrying possibilities you have never learned how to notice. That possibility changes the mood of the whole story. Up to this point, you could still keep these traces at a safe distance. Interesting facts, a few odd remnants, a handful of old biological notes written into the body. But when you think of them as present possibilities, not just past evidence, the feeling shifts. The body becomes less like a finished exhibit and more like a living document, still carrying margins, crossings out, older lines showing faintly through the page. And that is where the idea of minor function becomes so important. Those older structures were not all left behind like empty shells. Some stayed and kept small roles, quiet roles, supporting roles. The fold in the eye did not remain as a full sweeping lid, but it remained. The coccyx did not continue as a tail, but it stayed in the body rather than vanishing from the map. Goosebumps no longer lift a useful coat, yet the reflex still moves through you when cold or emotion reaches the skin. The newborn grasp no longer serves fur clinging in the old setting, yet it appears with unmistakable force at the beginning of life. That is the part Robert Wiedersheim's list from 1893 could not fully settle. He was early enough to recognize the pattern, but later science had to refine the meaning. A reduced trait is not the same thing as a dead trait. A vestige can lose its original reason for being obvious and still remain woven into present anatomy. Neither prominent nor central, but not meaningless either. That matters because it rescues the body from a very shallow reading. These are not abandoned scraps scattered through human form. They are altered inheritances, old features softened, scaled down, redirected, sometimes still quietly helping while also pointing backward to another world. And once you accept that, one more boundary begins to blur. Because if a trait can be both old and still active in a minor way, then the line between past body and present body may be far less clear than you were taught to believe. That blurred line is where the story becomes gentler and stranger at the same time. Because once you stop dividing the body into old and current as if those were separate rooms, something relaxes. The skin reflex is old, yes, but it still belongs to your present life. The fold in the eye comes from a much earlier form, but it is still part of the face you wash each morning. The tail remnant is ancient in origin, yet it sits in the spine you use every day without a thought. Even the newborn grasp is both things at once, a sign from a deeper past and a real event happening now, in warm fingers, in a living hand. This is why the body is so hard to read if you come to it expecting clean categories. You want one trait to be for now, another trait to be from before, and a third to be no longer relevant. But living form does not sort itself so neatly for your convenience. It overlaps. A structure can be reduced and still present. A reflex can be inherited and still felt. A shape can come from older bodies and still help make up the one you call your own. That is also why the word vestige needs care every time it is used. It should slow you down, not close the case. It should make you look twice to notice continuity. Robert Wiedersheim's list in 1893 opened one door, but later understanding made that door wider and more honest. The body is not full of dead relics. It is full of altered carryovers, softened traces, small reports from earlier forms still folded into the present. And when you really let that in, the emotional center of the subject shifts. It stops being a story about leftovers. It becomes a story about belonging, about the fact that your body did not arrive here alone, all at once, fully explained. It arrived carrying older solutions inside it. Which means the next question is no longer only anatomical, it is personal. What does it do to you to realize that even your most ordinary body is part memory? That realization can land in two very different ways. For some people, it brings a flicker of discomfort. If the body carries so much that is older than the self, then the self can start to feel smaller than it did a moment ago, less sealed off, less original. You may feel that for a second too, lying there, hearing the room settle, feeling your own breathing, and wondering how much of what feels personal is also inherited form moving quietly underneath your habits. But then something gentler begins to happen. The same facts that can unsettle you can also widen you. The old skin reflex does not make you less human. The small fold in the eye does not make you unfinished. The tail remnant in the spine does not reduce you to a diagram of the past. And that fierce newborn grip does not take anything away from the tenderness of the moment. It adds depth to it. These traces do not shrink the meaning of a life. They place that life inside a longer continuity than you were taught to notice. That is why the language matters so much. If you call these things flaws, you close the door too fast. If you call them pointless leftovers, you miss the feeling entirely. They are better understood as continuity made visible. Old forms softened into present ones. Older solutions folded into a body that is fully alive now. Robert Wiedersheim, back in 1893, could sense that human anatomy was carrying a long history. What later understanding kept correcting was not the history itself, but the easy, careless way people talked about it. And maybe that is the emotional turn in this story. What first sounded like a list of odd remnants begins to feel more like companionship. Your body is not standing alone in the present moment. It is accompanied by older versions of life, still faintly present in reflex, structure, and development. Once that feeling arrives, another question rises with it. Not whether these traces make you less complete, but whether they might make your place in the living world far larger than you imagined. That larger place is, in a quiet way, the real reveal. You began with a chill on the skin and a fold in the eye, and now the whole body feels different under your attention. Not broken, just older. The same spine that holds you upright carries a softened trace of a tail. The same newborn hand that feels so immediate can close with a pattern inherited from bodies that once had to cling. Even the smallest reflex can turn out to be a message from a world that no longer exists in the form it once did. And strangely, that does not have to make you feel smaller. It can make you feel connected. Because these traces do not separate you from the living world around you. They place you inside it. The old skin response links you to furred ancestors. The eye's quiet fold links you to a protective structure still active elsewhere in the animal world. The tail remnant links your skeleton to older body plans. The early tail in development, brief as it is, reminds you that becoming human did not begin from a blank page. It began from inheritance. That is why this subject carries so much wonder in it. It is anatomy, yes. It is development, reflex, structure, but it is also recognition. The recognition that your body is not a sealed, private object with no history behind it. It is part of a long continuity of living form, and some of that continuity still shows through if you know where to look. Robert Wiedersheim sensed something important when he tried to gather those remnants in 1893. Later biology had to become more careful than his list, more precise, less eager to call old things pointless. But the deeper intuition remained. The body carries witnesses to its own history. Once you feel that, one final shift begins. You stop asking only what these traces say about the past and start wondering what they ask you to feel tonight about the body you are lying in right now? That question brings you all the way back to the body you can feel right now. Your body, not the abstract body from a chart or the one from a textbook drawing, the one under the blanket, the one shifting against the mattress, the one warming the air beneath your hands. The remarkable thing is that none of these old traces asks you to imagine some distant creature first. They ask you to notice what is already here: a ripple on the skin, a quiet fold at the eye, the small end of the spine. The strong closing hand of a newborn. The past does not only sit behind you, it touches the present directly. And that changes the emotional weight of the whole subject. Because once you recognize those signs as inherited, you begin to feel your own form less as a private possession and more as a meeting place. Older solutions are still present in reduced ways. Older structures still shape newer ones. Older patterns still show themselves in motion, in development, in anatomy. The body becomes less lonely that way, less sealed, more connected to the long continuity that produced it. This is where the old misunderstanding finally starts to lose its grip. These are not embarrassing leftovers. They are not evidence that the body somehow failed to become modern. They are evidence that modern life is built out of older life, carefully revised. The coccyx does not need to become a tail again to tell the truth about where it came from. Goosebumps do not need to warm a coat of fur to reveal the age of the reflex. A newborn's grasp does not need its original setting to carry the shape of that older need to hold on. And maybe that is why these traces feel so intimate once you see them clearly. They do not sit at the edges of human life. They sit inside tenderness, cold, posture, touch, sight, the very places where you feel most present. So the next step is almost unavoidable now. If these old forms can make the present body feel larger, what happens when you stop treating them as curiosities and start treating them as part of what it means to be human at all? That question changes the body from an object into a relationship. If these old traces are part of what it means to be human, then they are not side notes anymore. They belong to the main text. The skin that still answers cold before thought arrives. The quiet fold at the eye. The small, fused ending of the spine. The newborn grip that closes with startling conviction. None of these sits outside your humanity. They are inside it. They do not weaken the present body. They help explain how the present body came to be. And there is a kind of relief in that once you let it settle. You do not have to imagine yourself as a finished product to be real. You do not have to pretend the body has no seams in order to trust it. In fact, the seams are part of the beauty. They show that life does not throw everything away and begin from nothing each time a form changes. It carries forward, trims back, reshapes, keeps what can still belong. That is why Robert Wiedersheim's old attempt in 1893 still matters, even after later science corrected the rougher edges of his thinking. He was looking at a body full of continuity, even if the language around it had not yet become careful enough. So the old fear, "Does this make me incomplete?" begins to lose its power here. It makes you historical. It means your body is not empty of context. It means you belong to a line of living forms so long and so patient that even now, in warmth and posture and touch, some of its older chapters remain legible. Present, not dominant or in control. A vestige is not a sign that nature forgot to finish you. It is a sign that life moves by revision, and that revision leaves traces behind. And once you truly accept that, the mood changes again. Because the final question is no longer about flaw or function at all. It is about whether those traces, once understood, can become a source of comfort instead of unease. That comfort does not arrive all at once. It comes slowly, the way your eyes adjust to a dark room. At first, you hear that your body carries old traces, and the idea can feel unsettling, as if something private has been opened up and shown to have a longer history than you knew. But then the feeling shifts. The same facts begin to soften. The skin reflex that no longer raises a useful coat of fur is still your skin, answering cold in the night. The little fold in the eye is still part of your face. The coccyx still belongs to the spine that holds you. The newborn grip is still a human hand, tender and fierce in the same moment. Nothing has been taken away from you. If anything, the body becomes more intimate after this, not less. You stop demanding that it be a perfect final draft, and you start seeing it as something older, wiser, and more patient than that. It has come through more revisions than you can count. It has carried forward what could still belong. It has softened what no longer needed to dominate. And it has done all of this so thoroughly that most days you move through your life without noticing the depth under your own skin. That is why the old language about useless leftovers never really fits. It is too cold, too shallow. Robert Wiedersheim could gather structures into a list in 1893, but a list is not yet an understanding. The fuller understanding comes later, when you realize that even reduced traits can remain woven into living function, living form, living feeling. A vestige is not a joke the body forgot to erase. It is continuity made gentle enough to live with. So now, if you feel the blanket brush your arm and the skin rises a little, or if you rub the corner of your eye in the morning, or if you shift and feel the base of your spine meet the bed, you may notice something new. Not strangeness exactly, recognition. And once recognition arrives, the very last step is close. Because the question is no longer what these traces are, but what kind of peace they offer when you finally stop resisting the fact that you belong to a story much older than yourself. That peace is quieter than an answer. It does not arrive by solving every mystery of the body and putting each structure into a neat labeled box. It comes from a softer recognition than that. The recognition that you do not need the body to be simple in order for it to be trustworthy. You do not need every old trace to disappear in order for the present form to be fully real. The chill on your arm, the small fold at the eye, the fused end of the spine, the inherited closing of a newborn hand, all of it can belong at once. The past does not have to be scrubbed away for the present to count. That is why these traces can become comforting instead of unsettling. They tell you that the body is not empty of history. It is held by it. Not trapped in it, held by it. The same living form that lets you rest tonight was shaped through continuity, through revision, through patient carrying forward. The older traces do not stand outside your life like foreign objects. They are folded into the ordinary tenderness of being alive now. And something else begins to settle with that. The pressure to imagine yourself as self-made starts to loosen. You are still yourself entirely. Your body is still your body entirely. But it is also part of a much longer conversation than one lifetime. Robert Wiedersheim could list remnants in 1893, and later, science could correct the rough assumptions around them, But the deeper fact remained untouched. Human form contains witnesses. Quiet witnesses, not loud or theatrical, built into touch, posture, reflex, development. So when you feel one of these old signs, you do not have to hear it as evidence of imperfection. You can hear it as continuity made gentle, a body that remembers without speaking, a form that carries more than it displays. And once you begin to hear it that way, the final turn becomes possible. Because what remains now is not the science alone, but the feeling it leaves behind when you return, very softly, to the simple fact of lying here in your own living shape. That simple fact of lying here is where all of this was always heading. Not toward a list or even toward a verdict, toward this moment. Your own body at rest, still warm, still breathing, still doing 1,000 quiet things without asking to be admired. And among those ordinary things are the traces we have been following all night. The old skin reflex, the fold at the eye, the tail remnant at the base of the spine, the fierce inherited grasp that appears in a newborn hand. None of them needs to become dramatic to matter. Their power comes from how gently they remain. By now, maybe the body feels less like an object you happen to own and more like a place you are living inside. A place built over time, layer over layer, revision over revision. Robert Wiedersheim, back in 1893, tried to gather the remnants into a human list. Later biology had to be more careful, more exact, less blunt with the word useless. But the deeper feeling outlived the list itself. Human form carries evidence of older forms, and it carries them quietly. That quietness matters. If these traces shouted, you would fear them. If they dominated your life, you might feel ruled by the past. But they do not. They stay small. They stay folded into the ordinary. A little rise of skin in cool air. A pink crescent at the corner of the eye. A fused ending in the spine you never think about until someone names it. They are reminders, not intrusions. And maybe that is why the comfort comes so late in the story. It takes time to understand that continuity is companionship, not a threat. The body does not carry its past like a burden. It carries it like an old melody almost hidden under the main tune. So now, as the room grows quieter and your own breathing becomes easier to hear, only one last movement remains. To say plainly what all these traces mean when fear has finally fallen away. And that is the last turn of it. You do not leave this story with a body that has become stranger than before. You leave with one that has become more familiar in the deepest sense. The little rise of skin in cool air no longer has to feel like a meaningless twitch. The fold in the eye no longer has to be an unnoticed oddity. The small end of the spine no longer has to sit there as a fact without context. Even that fierce newborn grasp can rest in your mind not as a curious reflex alone, but as an old hold carried tenderly into the present. The pieces never stopped belonging. You simply learned how to see them together. That is what Robert Wiedersheim was reaching toward, however incomplete the language of 1893 had to be. And that is what later understanding made softer and truer. A body made the only way living form has ever really been made, by carrying forward, by reducing without erasing, by letting old shapes remain in gentler forms inside the new. So when you think of these traces now, maybe you do not need to think of them as leftovers at all. Think of the way a hand-me-down coat keeps the shape of its first wearer in the bend of the sleeves, and still warms the next person all the same. Think of a staircase in an old house, smoothed by feet that are long gone, yet still carrying weight in the dark. The mark is not a flaw. It is proof that something has been lived in, used, passed onward. Your body is like that, not empty of history, but made beautiful by how much history it can hold without breaking. The room is quiet by now. Maybe your eyes are heavier. Maybe the blanket has cooled at the edges and your skin answers with that tiny old signal once more. You do not have to solve it. You can just let it be small and ancient and yours.